Good morning. I'm Phil Weilerstein with VentureWell, and I'm here today to present a panel that we've pre-recorded for you on strategies for advancing equity in higher education, innovation, and entrepreneurship. To set up the panel, we've got a presentation by my colleague, Shaheen Mamawala, who will present a series of 6 action areas derived from work that VentureWell has undertaken to better understand how to act on advancing equity in the higher education space. Shaheen?
Hi, I'm Shaheen Mamawala. I'm a Senior Development Officer at VentureWell, and I'm the co-author of VentureWell's recent report, Advancing Equity, Dynamic Strategies for Authentic Engagement in Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Really happy to have you here with us today. And in a little bit, you're going to be hearing from some panelists in the field who are testing out a lot of strategies, ideas, and solutions for advancing equity within their campus contexts. But first, I wanted to just give you a quick overview of our report and share some key recommendations and findings. First, I just wanted to say a quick word about VentureWell. We are a nonprofit organization based in the United States, though we do work globally as well. And our mission is to cultivate innovators in science and technology who are working on complex challenges and seeking to create lasting impact through the ventures that they develop and scale. And this equity report is part of a project funded by the Lemelson Foundation, and it's also part of a broader organizational commitment around equity and inclusion. And in the panel, you'll hear a couple of my colleagues from VentureWell speak to that a little bit more. Additionally, this report was informed by a national study that was conducted by the firm Quality Evaluation Designs, or QED. And in terms of methodology, QED both did an environmental scan and also interviewed dozens of early stage innovators as well as program directors, both from higher education and from nonprofit organizations. I wanted to say a little bit about sort of the issues that are behind the desire to create this report. And so first wanted to address the fact that the current composition of students in STEM is simply not representative of the diversity of our society. And really, we know that's about a lot of structures and systems that continue to deny some groups meaningful participation and engagement, while simultaneously accelerating and amplifying those from majority groups. And so the first part of this slide, we really just wanted to share a little bit in terms of focusing on the who. So from VentureWell's perspective, we're really focusing on amplifying the voices and access of the innovators from groups that are listed here. And in the collective, both in the report and in the presentation you'll see today, we reference those as underrepresented groups. However, we also acknowledge that language is adaptive and fluid and constantly changing. And so right now, that's our proxy to really best describe who we're engaged with and aiming to serve. But as always, are very open to and seek feedback around language and what's resonant to our audiences. So I wanted to jump in and really frame up, there were 6 different interrelated areas for action that sort of formed an interconnected framework of ideas and recommendations that came out of the study. And the first of those is about conducting authentic outreach. Really, this is about ensuring that interactions coming from entrepreneurship and innovation programs out towards students is intentional, it's relational, it's engaging, and it's tailored. So certainly always wanting to be thinking about how to differentiate and really look for mutual interests and values when inviting students to the table. And as well, stories and representation, both in terms of web images and copy, the staff members who are available to answer students' questions, and for example, in the context of giving a presentation at a student organization, who goes to make that presentation, and do they stick around? Are there ways that students can really see themselves in the program? Action area 2 is about creating inclusive spaces. And this is about both creating safety as well as an inviting place that students want to be. Part of that is around modeling and specifically in terms of sharing opportunities whenever possible for those members of your staff or program directors to really talk about your own story, to really elevate the barriers as well as the opportunities and successes in order to really help students start to see how their interests could fit into an innovation pathway. It's also really important to audit the physical space in terms of thinking about different learning styles, as well as making sure that students of all differing physical abilities can come into the space and maximize it. And finally, really rising to the challenge of creating brave spaces. In the report, we talk a little bit about shifting from safe spaces to brave spaces, which are really sort of pushing the boundaries of discomfort, but in a way that is inviting and engaging and grounded in listening and sharing. Action area 3 is about building confidence. And part of this is really anticipating and planning for the dynamics that students may bring with them when they come into your space, especially for students who are in the earliest stages of exploring an innovation pathway. There's a tendency to feel uncertainty, to feel like an imposter, or that everyone else may have it figured out. And so really being attentive to that, demonstrating empathy, and finding ways to really reinforce that exploration is not only valid, but it is welcomed. Additionally, and this is something VentureWell focuses on a lot, really thinking about ways to make sure that there are opportunities for individual development and sort of leadership development opportunities alongside business development and skills building, especially for students who are working towards developing and commercializing their products. Action area 4 is around engaging mentors and specifically thinking about the ways in which mentorship can take many forms. So students seek mentorship from their peers, from faculty and staff, and they're often looking for both shared skill sets in terms of the things that they need to know and learn as they go through their innovation pathway, but also, and this was particularly resonant for students from underrepresented groups, looking for people who share one or more of their identities and really feeling like their mentors truly understand the different things that they're bringing to bear as they think about possible ways that they're going to pursue innovation or different career options. Additionally, it came out of the study that mentors themselves, so a lot of those faculty and staff, reflected on the fact that they too could benefit from additional resources and support. Some of them felt more comfortable with innovation and entrepreneurship tenets. Others felt more comfortable within STEM and more quantitative skills, and really having mentors help each other and bring each other in is a really important way to help students advance. Action area 5 is about validating multiple pathways to success. And this comes down to 2 key points. So the first being language. The study found that many students did not find the term entrepreneur nearly as resonant as terms like innovator, change maker, or someone who is mission driven. So really thinking about using all of those different words to be as inviting as possible and really expand the definition for students to help them see bridges between where their interests currently lie and how that might apply to innovation. Additionally, acknowledging that students come from many different communities, backgrounds, and perspectives may require programs and program staff to unlearn previous assumptions about what constitutes a good fit for a program, and really to help students to uncover different motivations they may have and ways in which that may manifest as they develop their venture. And finally, thinking about action area 6 is really grounded in holistic organizational opportunities to advance equity. And this is something that many of you may be thinking about or may have seen within your organization. So part of it at the outset is really signaling and stating commitments. And that can happen both in word, in the sense of senior leadership making organizational announcements, statements, et cetera, but also in deed. So thinking about existing and new policies that could come into play, inviting new partnerships and stakeholders to the table and really helping to think that through. Additionally, staff learning and inquiry spaces are extremely helpful in normalizing conversations about equity, about systemic racism, and really helping staff to share with each other what they're learning and what they're seeing in their interactions with students. And finally, thinking about objectives, knowing that this work is complicated, this work isn't clean or often simple, and so therefore it's important to really think through and not only share goals from an organizational level, but also think through ways to measure them and also to transparently engage in feedback loops with different members of your stakeholder community. So with that said, before I go, I wanted to share a couple of upcoming opportunities. So one is that VentureWell will be launching a series of community conversations starting this October that will dig into different action areas with more depth and in partnership with a number of stakeholders who are working across different parts of the country and in different contexts. And more information will be on our website soon. Secondly, would welcome any follow-up to equity@venturewell.org with ideas, best practices, questions, or anything else you want to share. And with that, I hope you enjoy the panel conversation and really appreciate the opportunity to share this introduction.
Thanks for that great presentation, Shaheen. Now we're going to shift to a panel session. We've got a great group of panelists with us, and we're going to be exploring in the panel how we connect the best practices and action areas that were described in the presentation you just heard to take action locally at your institution or to inspire your colleagues to join you in developing a plan to do so. The focus today is how to advance equity and broaden participation in the community college setting, specifically focusing on entrepreneurship centers and programs. We're going to focus, in addition to thinking about that broadly, to some of the specific challenges that we face today in the COVID context in working in virtual environments. I'd like now to introduce my distinguished panelists briefly, who will then go on to introduce themselves. We have with us Jimmy Choi from Arizona State University, where she's the founding director of the Edson Entrepreneurship Program and Associate Vice President of ASU Knowledge Enterprise. Onio Biatcha, who is Managing Director at the Choi Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale University. And Eli Velasquez, who serves as the Director of Venture Development at VentureWell. Jimmy?
Sure. Hey, Phil. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Jimmy Choi. As Phil mentioned, I'm the founding executive director of the Edson Entrepreneurship and Innovation Institute at Arizona State University. I've led entrepreneurship and innovation at Arizona State University for almost the past 5 years, but we were fortunate to receive an endowment gift during this time and named the institute in honor of a lifelong entrepreneur and somebody who's been a great supporter of the university. In addition, I'm an associate vice president of Knowledge Enterprise, which is the division of the university that advances research, that supports clinical partnerships, strategic partnerships, economic development, and again, at a pan-university setting overall. This work is incredibly important to me, and it's been a cornerstone of the work that we do, not only at Arizona State University, but in terms of my overall life and devotion to the idea of inclusive principles and equitable practices that lead to and foster diversity and belonging. So this panel discussion is very close to me personally, so I thank you for inviting me to be here.
Thanks for joining us, Jimmy. Oni?
Hi, thank you all. My name is Onio Biatcha. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am the managing director of the Choi Center for Innovative Thinking at Yale. So it's entering its 4th year, and it's a product of Joseph Tsai, what we call a double blue, a Yale College and Yale Law alum, who is also co-founder of Alibaba, and during his time at Yale, really was inspired by the people and from different backgrounds and settings that he was able to meet and discuss and just work with over a long period of time during his Yale tenure. So during, now that he kind of found some commercial success, he thought it was imperative to develop a center focused not just entrepreneurship or innovation, but innovative thinking. What are the mindsets and attitudes and behaviors that individuals can adopt to take on an entrepreneurial mindset, whether it's actually starting a business or starting a project or anything in between. So this work comes directly from Joseph Tsai. I think one of his main sayings is the foundation of excellence is diversity. And in order for us to be the center of excellence, we need to be as diverse as possible through lived experience, through demographics and everything in between. So excited to be here and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And Eli?
Thanks, Phil, and it's an honor to be here with Jimmy and Oni. I'm Eli Velasquez, Director of Venture Development at VentureWell. My role is to really facilitate the support of early stage innovative programs and their intersection with investor networks. And so obviously having a broad base and a diverse set of investors that these early stage innovators can tap into is critically important. And more so having investors that look like them, that talk like them, have been through the same experiences as them is equally as important. So a lot of my role is building those investor ecosystems, but also helping to design our early stage innovator programs to make sure that there's a lot of congruency and a lot of alignment across those boundaries. My background is also in academia, having run the tech transfer office for the Texas Tech University system in the past, building angel networks there, having seen some of the challenges, but also the opportunities to build something from scratch, and taking those learnings into the research that we've been doing at VentureWell, which we'll be discussing on this panel, and how we can actually build those initiatives on campus to be incredibly inclusive, to be equitable, and to include multiple voices across the board, across multiple facets of the university. So very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you all. The first place I want to start here is just to talk a little bit more about the study that Shaheen presented. And Jimmy, you were very involved in the development of the underlying work that led to that report. And I'd be interested in some of your thoughts about the approach taken and how that is sort of visible in the lessons and takeaways that came out of the study.
Yeah, Phil, thanks. I was really honored to be part of the project advisory team for the study. One, because it's an important area for us to not only understand and explore, but provide some actionable information to people, right? And I think that's one of the core things VentureWell was looking for is to say, how do we actually take all that we know? And there was no longer this question of whether or not inclusion and equity is important in entrepreneurship innovation. Like that was just a given. And when you start with that given, that inclusion and equity is a critical component of being able to advance an innovative agenda, whether it's for an institution, whether it's for our nation as a whole, for our communities, then the next question of like, how do we actually get there was critically important. And so we did have a chance to work with you, with the team, with the consultants that was actually designing the study, and try to dimensionalize this in a way where the approach is really about, and you could see these 6 different approaches, right? There are different avenues and pathways into attacking the problem, into creating real solutions, and then into creating lasting impact and change. And so the idea of creating lasting and impact and change is that this is not going to be a one and done, right? There's not one thing that you do. It's not one person that you hire. It's not one competition that you promote. It's not one program that you say, oh, this is for our founders of color and everything else is for everyone else. So the main thing that we saw was that the approach had to be multifaceted. There had to be follow through. It had to be doable. Everything that you're recommending and trying to take on, the barrier, the same way that we talk about when we're telling people, to create something new, the barriers to entry had to be low enough that people felt encouraged to do it and try it. And then finally, to not let perfect be the enemy of the good. There is no perfect, right? There's no perfect metric for us to say, how do we know we've achieved everything in terms of social justice, social equity? We want harmony, we want balance, we want real reflection of our communities. But don't let this idea of I need to get to this state of perfection and this is what it looks like in order to get started. I think the real approach here, again, is multifaceted, follow through, let it be doable, don't put barriers up before you even start with anything, and then don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Like iterate, try different things. As long as your intention is true and the intention is to create an inclusive and equitable environment and inclusive and equitable programming, then if that's your guide, then everything that you try, if it's responsive to that, can be successful.
Great. Next question is for Eli. I'm curious, Eli, if you could give us a view of how we're implementing some of these strategies in our work at VentureWell.
Sure. So one of the things to follow on what Jimmy was saying is that the report that we published, think of it as a starter recipe guide. And those meals only get better when everybody adds their recipe and their own little flair to it. And that's how we've designed it. And so as we look to put in our own first dish, if you will, into the ecosystem, we're starting with our E-Teams program. Those are our early stage innovators. They're coming as early as the undergrad level. but we do see a broad spectrum of those individuals come into play. And so we thought, yes, the early stage innovator is at the core of our customer, but there's a whole slew of other individuals that are supporting them along the way. And there's faculty members, there's administrators, there's the economic development, the investors. So when we start looking at our approach, we of course look at it from the insight of that early stage innovator, and specifically the most scared person in the room is the perspective that we're looking at this from. So how do we ensure that that individual is engaged? What are the terminologies that we should be using across the board, even though we may get it wrong in certain places, but we're going to be putting that messaging out there to start to attract more individuals. At the faculty level, we're also engaging more faculty through the use of our programs, our grants, our trainings, to then start to make those linkages between those faculty champions and those early stage innovators. And then of course, we underpin all of this work with outreach, messaging, and marketing that is intentional, that is putting us at the forefront. It puts us in the offensive strategy to go out and find those individuals versus a build it and they will come approach. We're actively going out there and making those and building those relationships. So we're putting the concept of customer discovery to work in this process, right? And talking to customers, understanding what their needs are, and then enabling us to shape what that's doing. And again, under the framework of what our research has shown us.
Yeah, I like the way you frame that in the context of taking an entrepreneurial approach to problem solving here. And I'm curious, Oni, you've been working in this space for a while and doing some of the things that were in the report. I think your program is one that kind of embodies some of the work that we're hoping that people will do. And I'm curious which of the things in the report resonate most, and you give us a little more context of how you do that work at your center.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that fundamentally is so important to any of this work is, although all of our work is student facing, we took the time to be very intentional to say, how can we skill up our staff? How can we have a staff that's representative of the cultural competencies of the students? How can we have a staff that is just demographically representative of the culture of our institution? And really thinking through, we know as a unit, we can be able to be as resilient as we can and as we need to be when we're navigating these different institutions, when we're navigating partners, or navigating stakeholders. If we as a staff has the cultural competency and organizational cultural competency within the organization to be able to operate at a high level. So in practice, what does that mean? That means mandatory monthly D&I training, talking to LGBTQ resource group to say, come in and can you talk to us about pronouns? Can you talk to us about the different the factors that go into language that we use in our applications? Talking to the Native American Cultural Center and say, what is the land acknowledgement? Why is this important? How do we make sure we're not just breezing through this and actually honoring the tragedies and the harms that Indigenous people have gone through in this country, and on and so forth and so forth. So really upskilling our team was very important from the get-go, and being able to have those honest communications and conversations within our staff. So then when we operationalize the values that we have around diversity, equity, inclusion, those conversations are tough. But if we already know as a staff how to have these conversations, how to engage with each other at this level, how to fail and say the wrong things in front of each other, then we can do right by our students. So I think fundamentally, that's something I really enjoy from the report, is not always just looking at what type of programs or project that's student facing, but also looking within your organization saying, how are you making sure you're putting yourself and your staff in the right position to take on this long and hard work?
Yeah, so that sort of gets to my next question, which is about the authenticity of outreach. And that was one of the points that came across in the report. I'd love to hear sort of how you're actually doing that. What does that even mean?
Yeah, so on our end, that's a great question. So it means taking a step back and looking at who's on campus, who are the resources, who are the student groups, who are the cultural centers, who are the people who might have some type of particular affinity to a lived or learned experience or a demographic, and having that just in an Excel spreadsheet and just having listening sessions. Hey, how can we do better? Hey, what are the things that we're offering you that you enjoy? What are the things that you want that you're not currently getting? Or the opportunities or have there been any instances where one of our staff implicitly or explicitly has harmed you by something they accidentally has said? So it's all those things that we're thinking about on operationalizing a lot of this work is something that's really, really important to us. And then on the other side, I think, you know, it was touched on before very well. So when we're thinking about reaching out to people, it's not that if you build it, they will come. But when you have people in those listening sessions, then you really have to honor their input, honor that you might have done something to harm a student that you don't even know about. I mean, again, to kind of put it in practice, the other day we invited an Indigenous entrepreneur to come speak to our students, but we didn't inform the Native American Cultural Center student group. And this is something that's very important to them. And they reached out to us saying, hey, we're really disappointed that you all didn't reach out to us, and we're really disappointed because also understanding that, you know, Yale as a monolith isn't actually a monolith, but there are so many times that underrepresented students have experienced harm, cultural harm from the university, that we can't be under the guise that we're operating with they're not always assuming that we're operating with the best intentions. So automatically they're going to say, hey, you know, we've seen this time and time again in other places. How do I know it's the right? So at that, all we can say is, you know, we messed up. We want to be better. We want to be authentic in our work, and tell us how to best to show up. So I think listening actively and really operationalize that feedback and those critiques and those compliments that we hear has been really, really crucial for it to be authentic, and continuing even when we get knocked down again and again and again and we fail and roll over, we just get back up and saying, we're dedicated to doing this work right, and we're going to continue to do it no matter what.
Yeah, so it's a journey of learning. And Eli, you've been, you know, really an advocate for issues of equity in our early stage and venture programs for a long time. And I'm curious kind of if you could talk about the learning journey around that authenticity, and in particular around the engagement of some of the non-student inputs to the program, you know, mentors, advisors.
Yeah, we've been extremely, to Oni's point, extremely intentional. And one of the approaches, you know, when you're out doing customer discovery, right, you're tapping all these resources from LinkedIn to conferences to different newsletters. So my email is jam-packed with different organizations that are doing all sorts of different work in different spaces, articles. I keep a running list of mentors, potential mentors that I believe would be critical. And then I reach out to them. But one of the things that I have found in the authentic outreach, and we find this a lot, is getting to the real person, right? So I always share with them, Oni, what's your journey? And Oni will say, well, you know, I'm director of this. I said, no. What's your story? What's your personal story? When we get to the personal story, 100% of the time, I always find something that's relatable, right? Whether we went to the same schools or we went to the same like conferences, or we're connected to certain people, we've traveled to certain places, inevitably, it never has failed that we find a link. And that's the authenticity that we can start to grow from. And that has enabled us to build these very, very deep relationships with mentors who continuously dedicate time and effort, you know, volunteer their time, because they know that we're coming at this from an authentic perspective. And so I think, you know, when people say, how should we do this? You know, it really comes down to just getting to the real person, because behind every title, behind every institution, there's an individual who's putting their best effort to try to make their institution much better. So if you can find that common link, that's what's going to drive it.
Yeah, Jimmy, you have done this at scale in a large institution, and you have a lot of faculty who engage with your programs. So I'm curious whether that approach that Eli described is sort of at the core of what you're doing there, and what else do you need to do to draw faculty in and maybe help educate them about issues around equity and how they need to actually change their own teaching behaviors?
So it's critical to start with the person. I think that's absolutely right, because the authentic outreach actually links to the authentic intent. And the faculty, right, that have an absolute intent to work with people to help advance them in whether it's topical knowledge or in their life overall, that's at the core of, right, being on the faculty and wanting to be engaged with this population, wanting to be in this kind of role. So one, it's really tapping into the authentic intent that faculty have, and then others have, whether they're mentors or volunteers or donors. Two, I would say not only tapping into their intent, but then tapping into their expertise. And it has to be both, right? It has to be, I honor you as a person, but I also value you for your expertise. And when you start with the idea that I value you because of your expertise, your experience, your knowledge, then it becomes far less about, I value you because you're a woman, or I value you because you're a person of color, which is good. But when you start with that, it can be off-putting, right? You don't want to start with central casting. You don't want to start with, oh, I just need to have a Black person in the room, because then it'll make everybody feel more comfortable, as opposed to, I would like to engage you for your expertise, your subject matter. I'm valuing your time, your engagement, and does it absolutely help and matter to people that your lived experience, that how you present your social identity is resonating with people we're trying to work with? Absolutely. But I think starting with the idea of central casting can be quite harmful. And we've heard everything from what it means to be tokenized and what it means to be, selected for really shallow issues and having no idea. So the recommendation I make is to do the work, to know what subject matter expertise does that faculty really have? What experience might they have also themselves with starting up a new venture? What experience might they have in their industry partnerships? Why are you asking this person to do it? And if you can't answer that question in an authentic way, that's clear that I know you, I see you, I've studied, and I've understood the value that you could bring, then it immediately starts off as transactional. That transactional, hey, give me an hour, do this, do that. And that's the relationship that you don't want for this kind of work, because it is deep, it does get often super personal, and it does need to be long-term. So if you start with the idea that here's what we share, here's where our intent is shared, here's where we both have agreement about a vision of what we could be doing together better, then I think they're more willingness for people to come along with you, because they share the values and the vision of that overall. So that's my recommendation. It has to really be both. It has to be both intent and an understanding of what it is that you're asking another person to bring to the equation and to the table overall. Because then it also shows, I know you, I've studied you.
Yeah. So the community that you build, because what I hear you all saying is you're really approaching this as building a community. The people are obviously a key part of this, but what are some of the other aspects about creating an inclusive space? And particularly in the virtual world, what does that mean to create a space? And to think about it, it sort of stretches the mind a little bit, even to use those words. But maybe we can unpack that a little bit and explain to our audience what an inclusive space really is and how you build it.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm happy to jump in very quickly. I think, coming into the university setting, I've always said I want to create a safe space, right? I want to create an inclusive safe space. And oftentimes people, and the way I define a safe space is resilient. So we're able to have a lot of tough conversations that's not able to break, right? So imagine if there's something happening and someone tries to put you in a straw home when it's windy outside. It's like, and they say it's safe. It's not safe. It's not resilient. It can't hold what I need to hold. It can't protect me if I need to protect me. So I think to your point, when I think about building inclusive safe spaces, I think there needs to be a certain framework that can allow everyone to show up and be their whole full self. So very on at SciCity, we created a group of community norms: assume good intentions, show up on time, step up if you don't speak a lot, step back if you speak too much. What are the ways that you can really understand this is the SciCity norms, these are our values, and these how, again, we operationalize those values to show up in these spaces. So that's why if someone says something harmful, I can point to the norm that's on every wall that we start all of our staff meetings and the regular meetings with at SciCity and saying, hey, you are breaking this norm. It's a norm we all agreed on as a staff. It's a norm that we have our students through our orientation agree upon. So it's something you all know about, and it allows the opportunity to pull people in. So I think, again, just having those frameworks and those assets that people can point to, and not saying like, am I imagining this? Like, no, there's a certain way we want you to show up to this space, and having that be articulated in public spacing as possible, I think the better off we all be.
Great. And
Oni, I think, Phil, if I may.
Sure.
Oni, I think you raised an important point, though, where you're talking about both physical space and then psychic and emotional space, right? So the physical space is absolutely, it's just a mechanic to actually hold up the psychic and emotional space in many ways. So I think it's important that there's consonance between that, where you're not saying we've created this physical space to be really open and flexible and adaptive and responsive. And then meanwhile, the values and the norms of how people use that space and interact with each other is far from flexible and adaptive and responsive, right? So I think it's really creating this idea that there's a virtuous cycle that can happen between creating a space that allows people to use it the ways in which it's most appropriate for them or it's most helpful to them, physical as well as, again, emotional and psychic. And then using that as kind of an overall guide. As one example, it's in terms of removing barriers, right? Creating a space that's hard to get to, or creating a space that advantages certain types of students or certain types of people, whether you're a commuter, whether or not you have access to your own car in a physical setting. That's a whole layer of how do we create access, and then how do we create use, and then how do we foster belonging. I'll give you just one specific example. All of us have these, cool innovation spaces on our campuses. And almost always designers come into it with this idea of like, oh, we have to have the latest technology and the latest, cool furniture and cool chairs. Sometimes you're sitting there and saying it's off-putting for people to say, we want you to bootstrap your ideas. You can do it, put all your heart and energy and even your savings into it. Get your friends and family to invest, but we're going to sit you down in a $1,500 chair, right? And so really thinking about what the messages are that comes from the overall heuristics of an environment. I'll give you one last quick example. The idea of getting super cute with things like artisanal coffee. And if I need a master's degree in engineering to know how to use this coffee maker, it's a barrier. And so this idea of imposing what somebody thinks is cool and an amenity and doing it in a way that doesn't account for the differences, the plurality of experience, I think is super important when we talk about creating space, again, both physically as well as emotionally and psychically.
Yeah, and one of the elements of this communication, I think, is actually the language. And Eli, maybe you could speak a little bit to the way that we've looked at the language we're using, particularly in the engagement in the early recruiting and initial contacts that we have with people who are interested in our programs.
Yeah, that segues perfectly because, I want to touch a little bit on that prior conversation. Now in a virtual environment, you can create whatever persona you want to create. You could be a dress shirt person, but be wearing sweatpants, and for the record, I'm wearing jeans. But you can give off whatever persona, and that can lead to the inauthenticity of the engagement, which can kind of skew some of the environment. So what we try to do is use the language that is appropriate for the level of individuals that we're working with. And so if you're new to this space, I like to frame it and say, look, we're going to use words like Black and Latinx, African American, Hispanic, women, LGBTQ, and so we start framing and we say, use the language that is comfortable for you. And we're going to find how we level set to then start finding our way move forward in our programming, our training, our education. So we set the stage right off the bat. We go back and talking about, what is the authentic component of what makes you, you, right? So we try to get into what that person is thinking. What are some of the levels of confidence that you may lack? But by doing that, we enable the voices of our mentors, of our stakeholders to be in the room at the same time, sharing what their journeys are. And just yesterday, we had a very, very successful investor mentor saying, I've had 5 startups and I've made every single mistake in the book. So if you want to learn how to make mistakes, come to me, right? And that really level set the conversation because he's coming with that authenticity, and not coming at it from using, like to Jimmy's point, all these whiz bang type of words, but really level setting at that stage is what we have enabled our innovators to then engage safely on the Zoom. And I would even argue that when you start seeing a whole slew of different kinds of names, even names that I can't pronounce, that makes me comfortable because people have mispronounced my name too. So if that is something that comes across, then you know what? There's other individuals that can at least share that experience alongside with me.
Yeah, and what about just the word entrepreneurship? I mean, is that something that can be off-putting to people?
Yeah, we started doing some of the research where we found that, entrepreneurship can be something very nebulous, right, to certain innovators, but some have used words like creator, innovator, change maker, starter, founder, right? So we need to be open and adaptable to how we message that, how we talk about it, right? And be adaptable to making sure that as it lands with those individuals, we don't just cookie frame it for everybody else, but that we are able to provide that targeted support for those individuals. What's the language that you know? What's the language that makes you comfortable? and let's start at that level, right? And even up to and including, do you prefer to use more formal technical language, or can we just kind of, rap between you and I and build that kind of rapport and ultimately building a true inclusive space?
Yeah.
So if I could jump in on that, I actually agree with that, but I also don't want to run away from the idea of disruption from within. Right, so the word entrepreneur traditionally belongs in business. It traditionally belongs in scalable technology businesses, right? It's kind of been taken over by the Silicon Valley idea. So on the one hand, I think it's true, it's important not to impose that onto people, but I also think it's important to not run away from the idea either, and to, if anything, further dimensionalize it, right? Give it more dimension than it currently has, because the pure meaning of entrepreneurship has been overlaid through cultural and societal, and again, been largely run away with by the kind of Silicon Valley idea of what entrepreneurship means. So I think the empowerment comes from, one, not imposing it, but then two, having your ability to add your own imprint, add your own dimension to it, and then by doing so, actually disrupt from within the idea of who gets to be an entrepreneur and what does entrepreneurship look like. Entrepreneurship doesn't look like, right, just a Silicon Valley, hoodie male wearing technologist. It actually looks like, right, all of you. And I think that's an important thing in terms of actual self-agency and empowerment, is to be able to say, if something seems out of reach for you, that's okay, but here's how you also make it your own and then own it yourself.
Yeah, and I notice, all three of the programs that are represented on this panel work pretty broadly. So you haven't narrowed yourselves into, we're working on AI or we're doing work in a space. Is that a potential barrier to narrow the scope or space of what you're working on, or not? And I'm curious what your advice would be to people who are thinking about starting a program or a center.
That's a good question. I think us at Yale, again, when Joseph Tsai provided his gift, he was very adamant in saying, our key performance indicators aren't how many unicorns come from here, but it's about how do you have the opportunity to embed entrepreneurial innovative thinking into students in which they can take into any sector and any profession or any hobby that they go into. So I think to us, that's been very liberating and also very daunting when we have literally a biotechnologist in the same room with a documentarian and saying, okay, well, what does it look like to start an organization, start a company that fits your needs? So for us, it's been really, it's been a clear opportunity to, to Jimmy's point, start looking at the different dimensions of the word entrepreneur, start redefining the term entrepreneur, start redefining who sees themselves as entrepreneurs. I can't tell you how many, especially women of color, come to my office who have brilliant ideas, who are crushing it, who don't see themselves as entrepreneurs because they haven't been shown people who look like them. So providing that representation is huge. And I think we do a lot of work, and we go more school by school. So, we started a program early on called Divinnovation at the Divinity School. Say, what does innovation in divinity look like? As houses of worship have turned into, community economic development efforts have turned into, places for unstably housed people to find a place to sleep at night. There's so many dimensions that, a house of worship has changed into. It's innovating. And how do we honor that innovation as well as we honor a unicorn that might come out of our incubator as well? So again, just finding different dimensions of it has been really challenging and really such a liberating opportunity.
Yeah, and building into your program, because I think our objective in releasing these guidelines is not only at the kind of program practice, but also at the program building practice. And I'm interested to hear, because you're both program builders and you are building centers in an academic environment, how that thinking has actually been woven into the work that you've done so far, and how that's contributing to both the sustainability and the direction of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think Oni raised an important point, which is how is entrepreneurship relevant? How is innovation relevant to you, right, as a divinity school? So we've been able to do a very similar pathway across the university, which is, one, again, disrupting the idea of what entrepreneurship looks like, and then two, through that mechanism, being able to broaden the idea of entrepreneurship being a means and mechanism to problem solving. And if it's really about, problem spotting and solution creating, then that can be relevant for multiple disciplines in a variety of different settings. We found a lot of success in being able to partner with others. So that's another key thing in terms of, creating innovative programming, is that you don't have to be the originator of everything. And if you're the originator of everything, you're not actually working in true partnership. So true partnership really looks like, how would this resonate with you? As an example, we had a great conversation yesterday with our alumni association. Happens to be our alumni association, and a particular college is really engaged with the person, and it happens that she's an entrepreneur. And so we brainstormed together and thought about what's an engagement pathway for her that actually does the best work that it can for her as an alum, for this division as an alum of this particular college, and then for us in terms of entrepreneurship broadly. So I think when you think about programming with the idea of how does everybody input something that's of value to them inherently, and then could be of value to you in a greater way, it creates a lot of energy, it creates a lot of efficiency, it also creates a lot of partnership. It's fun to create things with other people. So programming for us has been very much about being responsive to individualized needs, but at the same time in a broader sense, and then using that as an opportunity for continued engagement.
Yeah, Eli, we at VentureWell are working to try and integrate this kind of equity and embed it in our programs. And I'm interested to hear your perspective in terms of how that's playing out and how you think it will affect the trajectory of the programs.
At the core of it, it's hard work, right? And this is where the organization has rolled up their sleeves from the top to everybody in between, right? And we've all engaged in this effort to really take a good hard look at of our programming and try to understand who are those core customers that we want to reach. But more importantly, how do we offer our suite of services across the board so that we don't get out of sync with us, even within the organization, being inequitable in how we're offering our programs. So we're taking a good hard look and working very closely across the different programs. And one of the questions that you raised, Phil, was, is it, can you get in the way if you get too narrow? The key here is we can't let the research, or we can't let all the what ifs drive us back, but we have to jump in together, right? We're all jumping into the pool. Some are going to end up on the deeper end of the pool, but we're not going to let anybody else drown, right? And so that's how we're approaching this work. And we have consistent discussions, both, to Oni's point, about let's have those hard conversations amongst the staff, and then let's turn those externally and then start building out the program. So, we're piloting some new initiatives with our eTeams program. We're piloting initiatives with our membership approach. We're piloting initiatives with our outreach. We're piloting initiatives in how to reach more investors of color, right? So you can see that there's a holistic approach to how we're doing this, even if it's one small bit at a time. If it's one small bit at a time and everybody's doing it together, it takes one big leap forward.
Mm-hmm. And Phil, if I can just hop in.
Sure.
If I can just hop in very quickly, just kind of, there's two things I want to talk about in terms of programming that I think speaks to your question. So I think one thing that we do with every program that's developed, we always know that a program is student facing. So we want to have a marketing plan around that can allow students who might be interested in that program, for our directors of communications and creative, to be able to know who to target, what school and what student population, what student group. Within that process, the program manager has to go to the communications director and say, hey, here's my program, can you help me market it? In that conversation, the director of communications has something called the SERJ, the Social Equity and Racial Justice Framework. And it's a list of questions asking, okay, who is this program meant to help? Who does this program, the sector that you're operating in, who is historically disenfranchised from it? And how are you thinking about providing opportunities for that population to engage in this program, knowing that that's usually they're not represented in these spaces. So it's like about 5 or 6 questions that then allows the program manager to think through, okay, you offering a program, there's value there, but historically, in a lot of these times, people are not represented in these spaces. So how, before you even go to communications director, are you thinking about a communications plan to allow them to have a seat at the table when you're building this out? And again, we're just building it into a DNA of our operations. It's just another thing that you have to do, mandatory step, in order to market your programming. And then the second is something called the SAB, the Student Advisory Board. So it's about 15 students break into 3 working groups, one on funding, one on mentorship, and one on programming. And every month they meet with the director of that particular department within the organization at Sci-City. And they say, okay, we as staff have to present to them, and that forces us to get that student input and allows us to navigate and have a better understanding of the student experience, so that our programming is hitting the points that needs to hit, and understanding, especially now, the different cadence and different nuances of the student experience that we might be overlooking as staff. So it's those two things specifically that we're thinking about when we develop our programming, in order for it to be more approachable and representative of more people.
Yeah, those are really great tools and frameworks. And I'll give the last word here to Jimmy. If you could talk just a little bit about how you maintain institutional engagement with this work, because you're working across an institution with a lot of stakeholders. And I think you've done a very effective job at doing that and keeping that engagement, sort of even building on it.
Thanks. So I think it goes back to the idea of authentic intent and authentic outreach. So when I approach faculty to work with us on certain things, or college deans or certain kind of divisions, I always make sure to go back to them and let them know what the impact has been or what that's regenerated, right? Oh, did you know when we first came to graduate college and we did this, and now did you see that we have an increase in the number of faculty that are doing this, or the number of students that are doing that? You have to let people know about the impact, because that impact then encourages, oh, that it makes sense. My time and effort and energy paid off into something, and I see how it contributes to our overall mission as a university. I think one of the things that was said before that's so important about this work is that when we talk about inclusion and equity at ASU, we talk about it in the absolute same header as excellence, right? So it's excellence with inclusion and impact at scale. At scale is something that's very unique to ASU, but that constant cycle of being able to talk about what we did together, why we did that together, and here's what the outcome was, that's rewarding. People like doing things that generate success, right? People really, and even when sometimes there are failures, people like understanding the idea of how that failure will then lead to something else new. So in the outreach, it's not the same thing, one and done. I go back constantly. I constantly do my rounds of here's what we did and here's what we tried and what's on your plate and what's happening, what's new for you and how can we help you do that. So if you go with a service mindset and a reporting kind of key metrics mindset, I think it generates its own energy. People like being part of things that are regenerative.
That's great. So we're going to have to stop here because of time, and we'll be taking some questions in the live session. But I want to thank you all for what was really a great panel, excellent insights, and some great practical recommendations for our audience. If you want to access the report, you can download it. There is a web link on the slide that's on the screen right now. Encourage you to communicate with us about what you think about the report, and to follow up with programming that we'll be doing in this space further, and in partnership with NACCE. And I want to thank NACCE for giving us the opportunity to share this panel with you today, and hope that this was a worthwhile use of your time. Look forward to connecting with you in the future. And thank you again to our panel.